Hello, welcome back. This is lesson 6 and we are going to be talking about Russia first, the Soviet Union then, and we are going to finish this lesson with the death of Lenin. So we will begin with the three last emperors of the Romanov dynasty, Alexander II, then Alexander III, and then Nicholas. And then we'll discuss the revolutions in which Nicholas was deposed, and then we'll discuss the new Soviet Union and Bolshevik regime. So this is what we are going to be discussing in this lesson, and I will just give you a general overview of the lesson. So the first thing that we are going to be discussing is the Emperor Alexander II. He is known for the reforms that he tried to implement. Unfortunately, for different reasons, they did not work. But the first thing that we need to look at is why he thought that Russia was ripe for reforms. And as we start looking into that, we have to study the war that is called the Crimean War, and it is the war that Russia fought over the Holy Land. But what is the most interesting part about this is the role of Florence Nightingale. So that's what I'm going to ask you to concentrate on when we look at the Crimean War. But Alexander, for him, that war was very important because he realized how behind Russia was. And as he was looking into the reasons why Russia had lost the Crimean War, he realized that Russia was behind at all levels: economic, social, even, of course, political. And he realized that reforms were necessary. So reforms could be done either waiting for a revolution or imposing those reforms. And he chose the latter. So he said, I am going to do the reforms and I'm going to do them the way I want. And so he decided that he was going to implement the reforms that he thought were necessary. Unfortunately for him, there were many groups in Russia that were ready for serious reforms, and they were not going to be satisfied with what Alexander wanted. What is what he decided to do? It sounds as a very smart move. The first thing that he decided to do was change the role of the peasants. So he ended what is called serfdom. That had been ended in Western Europe for a long time. Russia was behind, and he decided to give freedom to the serfs. As you read the Emancipation Edict issued by Alexander, compare that document with Abraham Lincoln's freedom of the slaves. Look at the similarities, look at the two rulers, where they are coming from, what their positions are, see how those two documents are similar and how they are different. In the case of Alexander, the abolition of serfdom was totally necessary, but he felt that he needed to give the serfs something to live with. He decided then that the serfs, once they were emancipated, they could purchase land. That was a very logical decision. Unfortunately, the land that they were going to buy from the Mir, which was the local community, and the land that they purchased was not the best possible land. The peasants could not live off that land. They had to stay in the land as long as they did not pay for it, and the result of it was a big failure. Now, the other reform was the beginning of a representative government in Russia, and that was a success. And it was not at the national level, it was at a very local level, but it was a very good beginning. However, there were many people who were not satisfied, especially the members of the ideology of liberalism, who were expecting much more. And there was a conspiracy to assassinate Alexander. The conspiracy succeeded and Alexander was assassinated. What is the result of that? Alexander II was succeeded by his son, Alexander III. And Alexander III was an entirely different person. His personality was different. He was a very powerful person, physically and emotionally. He was even too powerful for his family. He had total control of the family, total control of everything, and he was very angry at the fact that his father had been assassinated when his father was trying to do what he thought was the right thing to do for Russia. So Alexander decided to reverse all the policies that Alexander II had issued. So he went back to the traditional autocratic government, and even worse than it had been before. Everything was changed. He established a much more rigid and harsh system. He called it exceptional measures, and that obviously brought antagonism and unhappiness to the majority of the people. There was one good thing that he did, which was good for Russia, but at the same time brought extra problems, and it was the beginning of industrialization in Russia. That was done by a person that was a very smart and very efficient person, Sergei Witte. Unfortunately, and we studied that before, with industrialization came factories. With factories came working conditions for the workers that were not ideal. With working conditions, together with working conditions came living conditions, abuse of the workers. Therefore, the ideology of socialism became very popular. So we have then, while Alexander II is establishing a very harsh, autocratic, absolutist government, we have ideologies that oppose his government. One is liberalism and the other one is socialism. And that was the situation when Alexander II died and his son Nicholas married a very strong, attractive young woman. Her name was Alexandra. Alexander II did not like Alexandra. He did not like his son Nicholas to marry her. But Nicholas, being a very weak person, opposed his father for the first time in his life. And he said, if I do not marry Alexandra, I will not get married. And Alexander II was old, was sick, was afraid he would die and there would not be an heir to the throne, so he agreed to the marriage. And the one thing we could say is that Nicholas and Alexandra were very, very, very much in love. They created a very beautiful family. They started having children right away. The only thing that Nicholas did not like was that they started having only girls. So they had one daughter, another daughter, another daughter, and another daughter. So they had 4 daughters. The year that is perhaps the most important one for the future of Russia is the year 1905. It seems that all those bad things that could happen on that year happened even before the year began. The first important event was a war with Japan. There were so many problems, domestic problems in Russia, because of industrialization, because the situation of the workers was so poor. In general, politically speaking, Russia was in very bad shape. Nicholas thought that a war would unite the Russian people, and a war won by Russia would unite the people even further. It was the opposite. The most unexpected result was that Japan, which had been industrializing slowly and catching up with the West, defeated the Russian army in that war. And that was a total disaster for Russia at every level. At the military level, of course, but also psychologically. It was very traumatic for Nicholas and for the Russian people. At the same time, there were so many workers that were desperate for better conditions that they decided to appeal to Nicholas, to their little father. For the Russian people, the Tsar was almost like a god. They revered the Tsar, and they wanted the Tsar to help them. So they organized a march to the palace. Nicholas, in his weakness, decided not to be there. So he left when all these people were marching to ask for help, and his police shot at the crowd and killed several people. This is the event called the Bloody Sunday, and it was another serious problem for Nicholas. After all that, and given all this bad situation in Russia, a revolution started, and this is what is called the 1905 revolution. Unexpected by Nicholas, who was living in a bubble, and he got scared, and the result of that was that he decided to give in and promote some kind of representation by the people. And he created a new body that was called the Duma, something similar to Congress. He issued this very important manifesto. It's called the October Manifesto, and in the manifesto he declared that the Duma was created. That, if he had meant it, it would have been a very wise decision. The future of Russia might have changed if Nicholas had wanted to implement the change. But he showed that he never meant for the Duma to have any power. And when the people of Russia realized that the Duma was really not a serious creation, they became very, very angry. Aside from all the political and social problems, Nicholas and Alexandra finally had a baby boy, an heir to the throne. And that was something that they could not have been any happier, except they realized that their son had inherited a terrible disease, and that disease was carried by Alexandra, but it was passed on to Alexis, hemophilia. When they found out that Alexis, the heir to the throne, was so sick, and several times he was about to bleed to death, Nicholas and Alexandra were devastated, especially Alexandra, because she knew that she was the carrier. And she felt guilty, and she felt so depressed. And this was maybe for Alexandra and for the family the worst that could have happened. So they were desperate. They didn't know what to do. And as they are trying to find a way to cure Alexis, they heard of this supposedly holy monk who had healing powers and who could prevent Alexis from dying, and could even cure Alexis. So they asked Rasputin to come to the throne. And he did. He came to live at the palace and became the most important person for them, especially for Alexandra. There are rumors that Alexandra and Rasputin became lovers. There was never proof of that. There are rumors that Alexandra depended 100% on Rasputin. It may be true. And Nicholas also admired and respected Rasputin, even though Rasputin was not somebody who could be or should be respected. He had all the negative characteristics, but they were so desperate to find somebody who could heal Alexis, and Rasputin apparently had those powers. During all this, 1914 came, and with the year 1914 came the beginning of World War I. Unfortunately, Russia joined the war effort. And unfortunately also, Nicholas decided to lead the troops, to go to the war front. It is very difficult to understand why he chose to do that. The only explanation, or one of the explanations I should say, that historians give is that he was so tired of the problems at home that he decided to escape. Again, typical of a weak person. And we know that he was weak. So he decided to leave. He left Alexandra, his wife, in charge of the government, and Alexandra relied totally on Rasputin. So Rasputin became the virtual ruler of Russia. All the people around the government hated that, hated him, were very angry at the situation, and eventually they conspired to kill Rasputin. And they did. One of your questions is, why is the death of Rasputin significant? Rasputin was killed during the war. He was killed, in fact, in 1917, early in 1917. And the fact that during that time Russia was just suffering tremendously from the war. Only the first year of the war, about 2 million Russian people had died. They had not enough weapons. They didn't have anything for the war effort, and they stayed in the war. There were so many angry people, and when they conspired to kill Rasputin and they assassinated him, what that shows? It shows that the prestige of the royal family was so low that they didn't care. They didn't care to kill someone who was so significant for Nicholas and especially for Alexandra. And Rasputin died. There are many rumors and stories about how difficult it was to kill him. They tried to poison him and he didn't die. They shot him, he didn't die. Finally, he drowned. They threw his body, supposedly dead, to the river, and he drowned in the river. But this is an event that is important mainly because it shows that the situation in Russia was at the edge of disaster. And disaster did come with a revolution. And this happened early in the year 1917. And remember, Russia is still at war. And while Nicholas is at the war front, the working class women organize the revolution, and the revolution succeeds. And the result is that another type of government is established. And this is called the provisional government, while Nicholas is still fighting the war. When Nicholas finds out, he returns and he is forced to abdicate the throne. But the provisional government made a mistake, which, looking back, we realize it was a mistake. At the time, no one could tell what the outcome would be. But after Nicholas was forced to abdicate, the provisional government continued with the war effort. When it was obvious that Russia could not keep supporting the war, and that brought more antagonism against the provisional government. So during this time, the provisional government is formed by people with different ideologies. And during this time, the Soviets are formed. You can see here what the Soviets are. The Soviets are the councils of workers. And the Soviets were given a great deal of power during the time of the provisional government. But the provisional government is still failing. People are very unhappy with the way things are. They realize that this is not the route that they wanted. And during that time, Lenin, who had been in exile for several years, comes back. He, in fact, came back with the help of Germany, because Lenin had talked about how important it was that Russia would leave the war. So Lenin came back. He issued a document that is called the April Thesis, and in the April Thesis he made specific promises. The first promise was he was going to redistribute land so all the peasants would have enough land to live off. The second promise that he made was to bring peace to Russia, and that is what all the Russian people were desperate for. And he also promised to feed the people. So peace, land, and bread was the slogan that attracted many people to Lenin. So Lenin is a very eloquent speaker. He also promised to give power to the workers. So by doing that, you see how smart he was. He is promising help to the peasants, help to the workers, and instead of help, I should say power to the peasants, power to the workers, and peace. And that is what the Russian people needed. When Lenin began to organize a revolution to take over the provisional government, it seemed that Russia was ready for it. In October of the same year, only a few months after the March Revolution, Lenin and his Bolsheviks took over the power in Russia. I'm going to ask you to read all what you can about Lenin, about his personality, about his ideas, about the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, and how and why it was very easy for Lenin to take power at that moment. So once the revolution of October, it's called the October Revolution of 1917, happened, Russia then has a new government. And it is a Bolshevik government following the socialist ideas of Lenin's. Lenin claimed to be a communist, so Russia then becomes a communist country under the Bolsheviks. Lenin, was helped in all this effort by a very important person about whom I'm also going to ask you to read enough, Leon Trotsky. Trotsky was very different from Lenin. He was not as good a speaker as Lenin was, but he was a very profound intellectual, and at the same time he was a very good military leader. So good that later on Stalin was afraid of him and exiled him from Russia. What is what Lenin did once he took power? Very simple. He kept all his promises. So what is what he did? First, distribution of land to the peasants, what he had promised in his April thesis. The factories turned over to the workers, to the Soviets, his promise, and a peace treaty with Germany. This is called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk because it was signed in a place very close to, in the border of Germany with Russia, between Brest and Litovsk. So it's called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. This is a very harsh treaty against Russia. The Germans took advantage of the situation in Russia, but it was necessary. Lenin had promised peace, and he implemented peace. At that moment, and we are just speculating right now, if Lenin had been allowed to implement his ideals, Russia's situation would have been entirely different from what happened. But there were many people who opposed the socialist ideas. There were many people who liked better the liberal ideas, liberalism that we talked about. And there were many people, especially in the northern part of Russia, that were opposed to the Bolshevik movement, especially the Cossacks. And they decided to fight the Bolsheviks. And that began a very bloody and difficult civil war in Russia. To make things even worse for Lenin and the Bolsheviks, the Allies, even though the war is still going on, the Allies decide that they do not want a communist Russia, and they decide to intervene in the affairs of Russia. And they send troops and aid to the White Army that opposed the Red Army. So this made the civil war even more difficult for the Bolsheviks. Lenin, as I said before, I don't know, and we really do not know what he would have done without the civil war. But the civil war made Lenin issue policies that were, from his perspective, emergency policies that made war communism look horrifying. He established a secret police, the Cheka, that was executing people without due process. They were just killing anybody who showed any opposition to the regime. We would say it was mainly members of the bourgeoisie, so the middle class or the liberals, but it's not even true, because even workers or peasants who opposed the regime were killed. So the Red Terror became something that no one would have expected. But Lenin did it because, and he called it war communism. It was the communism that he had to impose because of the war. To be able to fight the White Army, he nationalized all the transportation means, he nationalized all the industries, all the banks, so the total economy of Russia was nationalized. And he issued policies to take all what the peasants were producing. This provoked a very strong reaction by the peasants, and the peasants decided to throw away their produce rather than give the produce to the government. This resulted in famine, in hunger. Millions of people were dying. It was one of the worst situations that Russia could have had. Between the war effort and the civil war, about 5 million Russians died. Eventually, the White Army, because they were so divided, they could not win. The Bolsheviks defeated the White Army, and Lenin then was ready to rule the country. Immediately after the Civil War, he began to change policies. He established something very different from war communism, which was called the New Economic Policy, NEP, New Economic Policy. And he began to do what maybe he would have done to begin with. The peasants were selling their produce independently. In fact, some peasants became very wealthy, and those wealthy peasants were called the kulaks. He allowed private industries, he allowed private shops, the agricultural output began to increase. So the new economic policy worked very well, and thanks to it, Russia was not collapsing. It was a very good measure. Unfortunately, right after this is working, Lenin changes the name, and now instead of Russia, the country is called the Soviet Union, the Union of Workers. Right after that, Lenin had his first stroke. He never fully recovered from the stroke. He had another one, and yet one more. And in 1924, Lenin died. And he could not continue with what he was hoping to do for Russia. And he left a country divided, and he warned the Politburo, the ruling body of Russia, against allowing Stalin to take over. What Lenin would have wanted was for Trotsky, his friend, his supporter, and a very capable person, to take over. Unfortunately, after Lenin died, Stalin defeated Trotsky, and Stalin took over. And that begins a new, very harsh chapter in the history of Russia. We will discuss that in the next, not in the next lesson, but in the next one, when we discuss the results of World War I. What we see here is the body of Lenin, which is preserved and on display in Moscow at the Kremlin. If you go there, you will see this, what we are seeing here. At some point, and I will show it to you later, they had both the body of Lenin next to the body of Stalin, both bodies preserved. But during the time of Khrushchev, they took the body of Stalin away, and only the body of Lenin stayed there. And with this, we end this lesson. Now it's time for you to go and look at all the details of the lesson and be prepared to take the quiz, and then be prepared for the exam.